The river smelled of leaf rot and iron, the wet copper of fallen beech leaves bleeding into the water where oars dipped and rose. Arya watched the ripples fan from the crannogman's paddle, dark half-moons that gnawed at the reflection of the sky. She was hunched into a borrowed cloak that smelled of peat smoke and frogs, boots rimed with dried mud from 100 roads, needle wrapped in rough linen and strapped along her spine beneath the cloth. The blade sat between her shoulders like a promise. "Keep low," the crannogman said. He had hair the color of moss, slicked to his skull by rain. His boat was hardly a boat at all, a shallow thing woven of reeds and sealed with tar, so light the wind seemed as likely to carry it as the water. "Crossings here aren't kind to tall folk." "I'm small," Arya said. It came out sharper than she meant, as if she were parrying him. Syrio would have rapped her knuckles for that. "I know how to keep low." He glanced at her, quick as a water vole. "I see you do." The neck breathed around them. Fog lay in the reeds like sleeping dogs. Once the boat slid past a stand of cattails and a green lizard lion's eyes lifted from the water, unblinking coins that watched and slid away with hardly a ripple. Birds cried somewhere hidden. A stillness lay upon the marsh that was not quiet so much as listening, and in it Arya felt the same tautness that drew between the words in the water dancer's hall. "Listen with your feet," Syrio had said. "Your feet will tell you where the next cut lands." Her feet knew the weight of the blade she didn't draw. They knew the shape of the river's bottom through the hull. They knew the way home felt. She had left Gendry and hot pie behind with a lie and a smile. North, she had said. Home. It had looked like an easy word in her mouth, small and bright, but it weighed as heavy as a chest of iron. She had lain awake the night before she slipped from their little camp, listening to hot pie's snores and Gendry's steady breathing, and the wind carrying the smell of oat cakes gone hard. She tried to shape the lie again, and it cut her tongue. She had not told them she carried a coin that might buy passage in a different direction altogether, bravos across the narrow sea, a word like a key in a lock, Vala Morgulis, but the word turned to winter in her mouth. She did not want bravos or black canals. She wanted stone warmed from within by hot springs, smoke curling from chimneys, a heart tree whose face she knew. She wanted Winterfell, so she walked. For days and then weeks, the world became a prayer made of footsteps. Dogged small folk trudging south told her of wolves grown bolder than men, of men grown worse than wolves. She skirted foraging parties around villages where walls of woven sticks sagged and fires ate roofs. She slept under hedges with the frogs and the ants and the smell of her hair, savoring the tenderness of a stolen onion one night, the luxury of a heel of bread the next. At the ford of a stream, she watched 3 crows harry a hawk from its kill, shrieks splitting the air, and took it for an omen. She did not know of what. And now the neck. The crannogman had found her just inside the bog country, a small figure with a big sword she never showed, and something in her that made men want to say yes to her even when saying no would have been easier. "I'm going home," she had told him, and he nodded like men nod when a tide catches them. He said he would take her where only boats and men of the reeds could go. "You know Winterfell?" she asked now. "I know 1,000 bows' lengths around it," he said. "I know which pools run warm in winter and where deer come to drink with steam on their noses. I know where the marsh makes a fool of a man and where a man can make a fool of the marsh." "You have people there?" "My people," she said. The words startled her with the heat that came off them. He pulled the boat forward and the reeds parted as if they were made for it. They slid beneath low boughs furred with lichen, past a strand of black soil so wet it shone like obsidian. The crannogman told her nothing of his name, nor did she ask. Names were a tangle she had learned to cut around. But he spoke of other things, of frogs and the way their chorus foretold storms, of herons and the brook trout that leapt for dragonflies. He pointed to a gray dome of reeds and said that beneath it a hollow log lay with a cache of spears, and that no one not of the neck would think to lift it. He spoke as someone speaks to a child they are teaching to use a knife, matter of fact, careful, assuming competence. In the night, Arya dreamed she ran with wolves. The marsh smelled wrong beneath her pads, but the north wind smelled right, and the rightness pulled at her until her legs ached from chasing it. She woke to the rocking of the boat and the Cranagman's quiet whistling, and her mouth was full of the taste of meat and blood and wild cold. She swallowed and spat over the side and said nothing. On the third day the mists thinned. The reeds opened their fists. The land rose under the water. Ahead, on a horizon burned gold by a sudden break in the cloud, the red ruins of Moat Cailin jutted like the teeth of a dead giant. The Cranagman bade her lie flat in the boat while he threaded them through channels so narrow they rasped like whispers. Only once did she dare raise her head to see between green blades the low causeway that ran through the swamps like a spine. The ruined silhouettes were jagged and sparse. She had heard the songs. How 1,000 men could hold the moat against 10,000. How the black line of the neck strangled armies with bog and fever. It looked like a place for ghosts. They did not go to the causeway. The man of the reeds ghosted them under it, through a culvert that smelled of rot and old stone, where the world became brick and drip, the bow's woven nose scraping the hard curve of the arch. When they came up on the other side, the air seemed cleaner. The man smiled. "South holds the neck," he said. "North keeps the north," as if it were a proverb you found in the mud. She left him where the marsh gave way to fir and birch. He refused the coin she offered, though he looked at it a long moment in her small palm, his eyes widening at the iron face stamped there. "Save that," he said. "You won't need it where you're going. And if you do, whoever you give it to will not be from around here." She slipped the coin back into her boot and gave him back what she had. A look that saw him, a nod like a promise kept. He blended into the boughs so naturally it seemed the trees had made him, and Arya was alone again with her feet and needle and the slice of wind that smelled of pine sap and snow very far away. The road to Winterfell was not a road but a vein through the woods. The ground rose and fell as if breathing. She counted her breaths. She counted the trees that bore the signs of men. Axe bites, knots of cord where lines had been slung, the crude notchings of a trail someone wanted to be found. When she came to a trap with its crude noose, she sprung it with a stick. She would not leave a neck to be broken for nothing. When she found a dead fire, she scattered its ashes with a boot heel until the gray was gray like all the rest. She gathered mushrooms from the foot of an oak and ate them as she walked, tasting the forest taste and the rain that had fattened them. Her hair snarled under its hood and her hands cracked at the knuckles. She thought of Sansa's soft hands, the scent of lemon in her hair. It made her walk faster. On the fifth night, the trees fell away like curtains, and there it was. A low roll of land stitched with stone walls, roofs that steamed in the cold, smoke lifting in blue ribbons into the sky. Even from the shelter of the wood she could smell it, the faint mineral heat of the springs rising from the earth, a breath out of the belly of the world. Winterfell. She bit down on her lip so the sudden ache in her throat would not escape as sound. There were banners on the walls. She had to force her eyes to see them for what they were and not what they should have been. The gray direwolf did not run there. Instead, beneath the main tower, black lines crawled across yellow. A kraken sprawled ink-dark, legs splayed, as if fastened to the stone by its own weight. She did not move for a long time. Her hands had stopped knowing they were hands. The wind pressed at her cloak like a friend who had none of the words. Winterfell was there. Winterfell wore another's face. When she finally moved, it was like a water dancer stepping forward once the music changed. Syrio would have said it did not matter what changed, only that she changed with it. She tracked the wall's angles with her eyes, counting bastions and men. Along the gatehouse, she saw helms as unfamiliar to her as the banners. Some wore long mail shirts browned with salt. Others had sewn bits of bone into leather as if to make themselves sharp. A few men laughed too loud. She could hear it even here. A boy walked the wall with a spear held wrong, as if wishing it were a fishing pole. The cold electricity that was anger gathered in her belly and rose, but the form it took was not a shout. It was questions. "Show me where the water goes," she thought. Stones had spilled water at Winterfell since the first men shaped them. Water remembers ways men forget. She drifted along the tree line until the curve of the wall hid her, then slid down a deer path that became a gouge in the earth. Her feet found the place where drainage channels ran beneath the scullery door, a dark iron grate where steam exhaled. If she pressed her cheek to the ground, she could hear the hiss of fat on iron and the mutter of a cook complaining about salt. She lay on her belly and reached through the bars and felt old corrosion. Her fingers, small and sure, found the pin in the hinge and worked it loose, inch by inch, breath by breath, like teasing a knot out of a snarl. When the last whisper of metal lifted free, she eased the grate back into place. Set, but ready to move again, and withdrew. She watched the wall, the gate, the godswood copse that crowned the inner keep, the tower that had fallen long ago and never been raised. She watched the comings and goings until the pattern of them sank beneath her skin. Winterfell was a song she knew. The Ironborn might play it on another instrument, with wrong notes and rough fingers, but the melody remained. Night came like a slow closing hand. Torches budded along the walkways, little orange fruit. A boy, small enough that he walked with the trot of someone always late, carried a basket toward the kitchens. Arya waited until he turned off the path to piss, set the basket down, and looked up at the stars as if he'd never see them again. She rose from the dark like it had lifted her and took the basket, leaving in its place a bundle of dead leaves that looked like a basket until you touched it. She slipped through the bushes and into the shadow at the scullery, lifted the grate, and went inside. Heat wrapped her like a shawl. The first breath nearly took her to her knees. Stone sweated around her, slick with the breath of the springs. From where she lay, the scullery floor rose to the kitchen proper. She put the basket before her and crawled, things bright as a dream. The red reflection of fire on the copper pots, a man's laugh, a woman's scold. Someone cursed the Iron Men under their breath for liking fish cooked to leather. The smells clung to her as if they were hands. She slid along under a table, turned, found the space between an open door and its frame, and stilled until it became a way meant for her. She moved. Winterfell inside was the Winterfell of her body, of that map her feet could read. She was a shadow of a shadow as she ascended the back stairs, slipped through the warren of servant passages, stilled in the dim behind the great hall's dais. A voice reached her there, familiar and strange all at once, because it was the voice of a boy trying on a man's manner and finding it too large. "You will do as I say," it declared, brittle with fear. The crack of hand on wood followed, and an answering murmur, men in reply. Theon, she thought, and almost did not recognize the shape rage took, because it was not a flood. It was a draw of breath too sharp at the edges. She wanted to open the door and go through it like the point of a spear. She wanted to put needle into the place where his voice came from and ask him if he knew her then. She did not. "Sirio," she heard, a white whisper under the sting. "The heart is the arrow's target. The arrow does not waste itself on walls." She did what a ghost would do. She went where the living did not look and found the doors that no one thought to guard. Not to the hall in its brute light, but to the lane behind it, the cool stone where the warm pipes ran, the little hatch that led down. Down to the belly of Winterfell. Down where the stone remembered faces that were not here anymore, and the faces remembered stone. The crypts opened before her like a mouth. She tasted dust. She tasted the old cold that does not belong to air but to time. She felt her way along, one hand to the wall and one at her hip, sure and silent, her breath measured by the beat in her ears. She did not light a torch. She did not need one. She could see by memory as much as by the faint thin lantern light far ahead. It was a trickle, that light, a ribbon laid across the floor from behind a bend. She drew up to it and heard breathing. Not the careful breathing of someone who did not want to be heard, not the slow breath of someone asleep, but the stubborn breath of someone who did not trust even his own chest but had to use it anyway. She lifted her head into the light and found two wolves looking back at her. Summer's eyes, pale as ice in moonlight, caught her first. Then a face so black it ate the lantern's light, teeth bared in a snarl. The pup no longer a pup, shaggy dog growing into the name. Both animals went still as struck iron, the moment before heat and shape decide what the iron will be. "Summer," she said. "Shaggy." She did not say it loud enough to make a sound. She let her mouth shape the names. If there was prayer in this world that mattered to her, it was knowing names and being known by them. "Who's there?" called a voice. Bran's voice, but lines had been carved into it the last time she'd heard it. Lines of authority he wore like new mail. She stepped out of the ben's shadow. The lantern, small, guttering, shone over little slopes of blankets and two boys within them. Osha loomed behind them with a spear like a branch of winter itself. Her gray eyes were a hunter's. They slid over Arya and narrowed. "It's me," Arya said. Rickon made the sound first, a low noise from a place too new for words. He shot from his bedding like a hare and ran at her and stopped at the very last instant as if crashing into a dream was worse than tripping. His hands hit her ribs and clutched, and Shaggy Dog surged, and Osha barked a thing in a language Arya did not know that froze beast and boy alike. The smell of wolf and boy and damp stone was so strong it made her eyes sting. She put her chin on Rickon's hair and breathed. Bran was slower. He was always slower, careful in the way of someone who understood that moving meant deselecting other moves forever. He pushed his blanket aside and lifted himself on his hands, dragging his legs. Summer went with him like a tide around a rock. "Arya," Bran said, not a question. He looked at her as if she were an answer he'd been afraid to say out loud. Osha's mouth cut itself in a line. "Who else knows you're down here?" "No one," Arya said. "Then leave no one," said Osha. "And leave us be." Arya could have bristled. The old iron in her rose to it, proud as the wolf on a banner. But Osha's eyes were Winter's, and the spear was poised exactly where it should be if it needed to be, and in that steadiness Arya found the only kin she'd been offered in months. Someone who knew how to survive by calculation, not by hope. "I know the passages," Arya said, and felt foolish the instant it left her mouth because of course everyone here knew the passages. But Osha tilted her head. "Do you? I know the stones. I know the way the walls warm near the pipes. I know the sally doors the ironborn won't. I know where they sleep when they want to be near the beer." She took a breath. "I know where Theon Greyjoy sits when he wants to look like a lord." Osha's mouth twitched. Not a smile. A concession. "And what is it you think to do with knowing all that, little wolf?" Arya looked at Bran, at the lantern oil smudging a crescent on his cheek, at the old dust that had made a number of ages in his hair. He was not a boy she could take by the hand and pull. Those days had become the same kind of legend as the old kings in the crypt, the ones who faced forward forever because someone had decided it should be so. "Get you out," she said. Rickon made a noise that might have been a suppressed cheer. Summer lowered his head and thumped it once against Bran's shoulder. A dog's gesture compressed into a direwolf's skull. Bran looked at Arya a long time. He did not speak for so long that she heard other things. The drip of water from a seam in the stone. The whisper of cloth as Osha shifted her weight to the other foot. The tiny scratch of a mouse far back in the dark. Then Bran said, "We tried." "I know," Arya said, and the knowledge surprised her even as she said it. She did know. The crypts were not a place you came to first. They were the place of last resort, of stone and memory and waiting. "We'll try again, but they'll have changed their watch if you tried once. We'll go where guards have learned to believe ghosts." "Where's Hodder?" The question leaped out, stupidly late, like a step she should have taken at the start. "Maester Luwin?" The faces turned as if someone had moved the lantern. Grief rose like damp, a cold that found the cracks in your bones. "Hodder's above," Bran said. "He comes when Osha says. He takes food where we say it should go. The Maester is where he always is when he isn't where he needs to be." He added, a bitterness so adult it sounded like something he'd borrowed from someone much older. "In his tower, sending ravens that don't come home." "They cut the ravens," Osha said, "or the sky eats them. Either way, messages haven't grown legs of late." Arya closed her eyes for the space of 2 heartbeats. People had become distances measured by birds. Birds had become metaphors for mercy. She opened her eyes so she would not think like that. "Tell me everything," she said. "What the walls hear, what the men say, where iron boots slap the most. The rest we'll find with our feet." They told her. Bran's voice drew the rooms as clean as a floor plan. Oshas chipped in with what men forgot to think about when they talked. Where they stood to warm their hands, which way they turned their heads to look, whether they took the second step or the third when they went up a stair. Rickon told her nothing useful and everything. The shape of fear in a child's throat, the way the light died when the lantern wick went low, the smell of Hodder's sweat when he carried both boys under his arms like sacks of wool and tried to make his feet silent for the first time in his life. Arya put each bit of it somewhere in the house of her skull where needlework would have been. Once, when they were done, they sat for a time and listened to the castle. She could feel it breathing. When she left them, it was with Osha's iron gaze on her back and summer's breath hot on her palm once. A stamp of allegiance that made some thing in her tilt and settle. She climbed into spaces she had learned with a child's daring and a servant's worldliness. In a passage behind the solar, she heard the whisper of parchment and ink. In the stable, she heard a man humming a song she had heard in the kitchens when she was little. The one about the piper and the maid and the mouse. The tune sweet and thin as if he meant to keep it to himself. In the great hall, a cup clanged, and laughs followed too soon, and a voice tried to crest them and failed. Theon. She found Maester Luwin by the slow heartbeat of his cough. He sat under the narrow window of his tower chamber, cold air combing his gray hair, a damp wool cloak fallen about his shoulders like a landslide. A clay lamp burned low, its smoke painting the stone above it brown. He traced a line on a parchment with a finger and then another, as if geometry might find a way out where prayers had not. Arya pushed the panel aside with a trick of latch and pressure and the memory of a maid who had shown her that trick when she was 6. The maester started and looked, his eyes black with lamplight. He was older than she remembered, or perhaps remembering had worn the age into him. He blinked and blinked again, and then the surface of his face trembled like water when a fish rises. "My lady," he said, and put a hand to the table because his body had forgotten what it was to stand quickly. "Just Arya," she said. The relief of saying it made her want to sit on the floor and lean against something and cry as quietly as water seeping at the base of a wall. "Are you well? As well as men get in ill times." He looked at the hole she had come through, at the shuttered window beyond his small desk, at the door he had surely barred and then rebarred out of habit. His eye came back to her. "You should not be here." "I should," she said. "There is no other place I should be." He stared at her a long moment. Then he smiled in that sorry way men did, the smile that belonged to funerals and the births that took mothers. "A stark answer," he murmured. "We thought you a ghost." "I am," Arya said, and was startled by the ring of it, as if truth could be a blade that sounded when struck. The maester's hands trembled when he poured water for her. She drank and tasted stone and copper and something like hope. He told her what he could, which was more and less than what she already knew. The Ironborn had come like a splinter under a nail. Theon had taken the hall and the words Lord and Prince like a man takes a cloak that does not fit him. He had to hold it in place constantly, and still it slipped. There were not enough men inside the walls to fight a battle that did not immediately become a slaughter. Ser Roderick had rallied men but not in time. Then the siege had been lifted before it began because the man who made the siege could not hold the world where it was. "There's talk," Luwin said, lowering his voice to a hush even though they were alone and hiding from what silence might do now, "of someone coming under a banner of help. A kinsman of the man who now calls himself Lord here. A turncloak returning with fresh men to turn him again." "Reek," Arya said. The name slid out without thought. She had heard it twice that day on men's lips with a curl like a bad smell. The maester's eyebrows went up. "If you know that name, you know all I do," he said. "We are inside a story we do not tell. Its author is elsewhere. Then we will write where we can," she said. She surprised herself. She sounded like a lord. She did not feel like one. She moved in the castle after that as if she wore Winterfell on her skin instead of cloth. She brought Hodder a small bundle of oat cakes wrapped in a rag that had once been part of her own shirt. He smiled at her as if he were looking at the sun. She pressed her finger to her lips and Hodder pressed his lips to his big finger and nodded so solemnly tears burned behind her eyes. She slipped a bone-handled knife from an Iron Man's belt one night when he had drunk himself to sway, and left it beneath Osha's blanket as if it had grown there. She learned the guard rotations at the east gate by the cadence of their boots and the way one man coughed every time he crossed the threshold. She learned that Theon sat in the high seat alone for long minutes before meals, as if the chair might answer him if he gave it time, and that he laughed too loudly when he had to laugh at something small folk said to him, as if to make up for the laugh he did not get to have at the voice in his head that told him he was a boy playing a game in a giant's hall. Once, in the deep midnight, she came within 10 paces of him in a corridor that smelled of damp rope and hot iron. He was walking fast with no one behind him and nothing ahead of him. The torchlight showed her the notches fear had carved into his face and the way he had sanded them with pride. Needle lay in her hand. The length of the blade was the length of 2 breaths. She stepped back into the shadow between 2 pillars and let him pass because the arrow does not waste itself on walls, and because she saw in his eyes a flicker of something she recognized from her own reflection at the pond near the Godswood when she was very small. A person looking for a story that made him less alone. She hated him for it and pitied him and did not cut him. Not then. At dawn on the 2nd day inside the walls, the bell over the yard rang twice, a sound that had been joy once and had learned other work. Arya slipped through an embrasure and saw in the yard a shape she had dreaded and half expected. Ser Roderick Castle, hair white as winter gruel, hands bound before him, his beard braided neat although his mouth was set. He looked like the history of the North threaded on a cord and carried into a square to be broken. Fear moved through Winterfell like weather. It lifted and lowered men's heads. Theon strutted before the old knight as if the yard were a stage and he an actor. He spoke. Arya could not hear the words, but she knew them. They tasted like a man offering excuses to an empty room. She pressed her fist to her mouth and felt the shape of her teeth through her skin. She had never hated so quietly. The blow took 2 strokes, because mercy is not guaranteed to the clumsy. When the blade did its work, when the work made a sound, when the sound became the yard's only sound, Arya did not look away. She gave that to Ser Roderick, to the man who had boxed boys' ears for sloppiness and loved them in the shaping. She swallowed the bile that rose in her and let it sour her blood because there are things you must carry or they are carried by no one, and then the world has no recollection of what was owed. That night Rickon cried without shame and Shaggy Dog's Keen raked the stone and Bran lay very still with his eyes open and no words left in him. Osha's hands were very gentle and very hard. "We go," she said. "Soon. The castle's a drum, and fools have begun to beat it. The sound will call wolves. The wrong kind." "Reek," Arya said again. It had already begun. Men spoke that name like a talisman because when you can name a thing you can pretend to understand it. "We'll go by the way the springs make for us," Arya said. "They warm the tunnels. Where there's warmth, there's breath. Where there's breath, we can take ours. We can't carry a warm pipe down the passage," Osha said, but she was smiling. She understood what was meant. She had lived her life trusting things you couldn't grab, only feel. The plan became a living thing in the crypt's dim. They would take the pipeway behind the old laundry, where steam made the stones sweat and a trickle formed that never grew enough to run. In that wall was a brick set badly 2 generations ago and never fixed because it did no harm to anyone who didn't know. Behind that brick was a narrow that would break a broad-shouldered man's collarbones if he forced it. But Hodder had a strength gentled by love and might pass with both boys in turn. The way would lead them to the base of the broken tower. From the broken tower to the Godswood was a hand's length if you placed your hand on the map of your skin where the blue veins ran, and Arya knew the way by the smell of the heart tree alone. From the Godswood they would go to the old drain by the tannery, where a grate she had unpinned waited to be opened a second time. And then, Luwin asked, because part of a maester's duty is to represent the part of the world that doubts. "Then the wolves will decide," Osha said. "I know the cover beyond the wall. I know the burns the Ironborn left when they came. We'll run there." She looked at Arya. "And the little one will do what shadows do. She'll fall across the wrong eyes." Arya nodded. She could do that. It felt like something larger than herself consented through her. "I'll fetch bread," she said, "and water skins, and I'll leave things where they can't find them when they look for what's missing." They moved at an hour when men think their worst thoughts and their bodies demand salt and water. In that hour, Theon slept badly and woke worse. In that hour, the men who watched the east wall dreamed of boats, and the men who watched the west wall dreamed of women. Arya made herself as small as the space between two breaths and slid through them. She placed the sack of bread in the ash beyond the laundry and the skins behind a crack where the light went to die. She left a handful of nails beneath a loose flagstone because men would not lift a stone unless someone told them to. She took a coil of rope from a peg in the stable and hung an empty coil in its place. When it came time for Hodder to fit through the narrow, he made a sound deep in his chest that Arya felt in the arches of her feet. Osha soothed him with words that might have been nonsense and might have been an old song. Bran clenched his jaw and made no sound at all when his hips scraped and his ribs pressed. Rickon kicked and bit until Osha snarled a whisper so fierce even Shaggy Dog blinked. Then he sobbed, small and hiccuping, into Hodder's big shoulder, and Hodder said his name very softly over and over until saying names became a kind of spell that could flatten stone. Both wolves went where they needed to go as if the earth had made that path for them. Arya went ahead and behind and beside all at once. She went where the air cooled and then warmed and then cooled again. She went where the walls sweating wet her sleeve and where it was so dry her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. She felt the castle's belly taking them through itself, and a ridiculous thought came to her briefly, of Winterfell giving birth to its own, and it made her want to laugh and cry and bite someone at the same time. They came into the god's wood like a thought arriving in the mind of a god. The heart tree's face stares in every light, but by lantern it stares into you, bleeding red from a mouth that never closes. The pool breathed steam like a great animal. Arya touched the tree's bark with the back of her hand as if to test if a kettle boiled, and summer spilled into her wrists up her arms, and all the names of all the Starks who had ever breathed under its leaves unfolded like a list in her head. She swallowed hard. Rickon went to the water before anyone could stop him and cupped 2 handfuls, gulping until Osha hissed and dragged him back by the collar like a puppy. Summer waded knee-deep and drank as if he'd never seen water. Shaggy Dog circled and did not drink at all. Bran watched. Hodder wiped his brow, and his breath steamed in the lantern light and drifted upward like a wish. "Go," said Osha low. "We cut the kitchen's breath too long." They went. The grate lay where Arya had left it, set but free. She lifted it with hands that remembered how to steady a slate full of ink while running from a sister with a brush. Hodder went first this time, Rickon around his neck and the rope around both, Osha guiding his feet by murmurs and curses and the occasional sharp slap on the knee. Bran slid after him with Summer so close his fur brushed Bran's cheek like grass. Arya went last, pulled the grate shut above her like a lid on a box of lanterns, and felt in her bones the moment the castle separated from them. The passage was low and wet. The water made a sound like a mouth trying not to cry. Outside, above, behind, she heard another sound. A shout dying into the sort of silence that only comes when someone realizes something that changes everything. They burned, someone did. She smelled smoke in the next breath. A note of panic rose in the castle's music, and then a tinny clangor that might have been a dropped pot and might have been the hammering of a warning. Arya listened for feet where the tunnel opened to the world. She heard nothing but wind. She slipped through the hole like a fish passing between reeds and put her face in the cold dirt and smelled wet leaves and tannery piss and freedom so close it split the skin of the moments containing it. Osha went like a huntress, her body angled to the lay of the ground, knowing where each foot would go before it went there. Hodder lumbered and tried to tiptoe, a heartbreaking sight that only made him louder. Summer went where summer should, a gray streak, a ghost. Shaggy Dog vanished into the tree line and reappeared like a shadow remembers itself. Bran took the world like a storm takes grass, bending everything around him into his passage without moving his legs at all. Arya stayed. She flattened herself beneath the low wall where the tannery met the outer yard. She listened. She watched. The guard at the corner leaned out into the yard and shouted for someone who was already running in the other direction. No one watched the drain. No one would until morning, when someone would come to curse the wet and the stink. She let the men run past her with their fear. She waited until the rope's end snaked back through the grate and into her hand. She tied it off to a root because the body knows that hands shake when you are done. When she finally moved, It was not to follow Osha and the boys into the trees. She kept low and near the wall and went the wrong way, toward the heat and the shouting, toward the great wooden door of the kennel where men had set a couple of dogs to bark to make more sound with less sense. She slipped in as if she belonged to the draft under the door. In the dark she found what she had come for by feel. The yokes, the leading lines, the meat knife hung where a butcher would remember it. A coil of leather with studs that a cruel man had left for a dog that did not deserve it. She took the knife and left the studs. She was 3 steps from the door when she heard a voice behind her like a familiar ache. "You there," it said. "Boy." For a breath she became Weasel again, the name the men at Harrenhal had given her because they did not like to look at how small she was and think of daughters. She could have run. She turned instead. Somewhere in the turning she was Arya, and in that space where she passed between selves she slipped needle loose. The Iron Man wore a beard as uneven as a rope frayed by a storm. His eyes had the yellow glint of someone who hated the smell of himself. He took a step toward her and the dog on his lead whined, low and doubtful, and then the dog put its belly on the ground. The man spat. "Up," he told the dog. Arya stepped into him, into the dark, into that place where men are surprised to find themselves vulnerable because they have assumed always that it is someone else's job to be surprised. Needle went in a thumb's breadth under the ribs and up. She held on to the hilt as if it were the one true thing in the world, and his weight flowed down the blade into her hands and then off to the side when she moved like Sirio had taught her, dancing her foot where the blood would not find it. He made a sound and the dog made a different sound and Arya made none. She wiped the blade on his sleeve, cut the dog's lead, and let the animal decide who it belonged to. The dog sniffed the dead man's hand and then went to the door and slid into the night with soft steps as if it had always been free. Arya left the kennel the way smoke leaves a chimney in still air, not so much moving as being where motion meant. The castle burned in places that would not matter to stone. Someone had tossed kindling from the store near the east tower and the wind took it like a rumor. Men ran with buckets in an echo of peace, their bodies remembering patterns older than raids. The night was too bright. Arya's skin drank the light and gave none back. She threaded her way along the scullery wall, past the laundry with its vats, into the dipping shadows between bales of wool that smelled faintly of lanolin and dust, and then into the black where only the pipes ran. She wrapped her arms around herself once, hard, so that her ribs made a cage for the heart that wanted to fly and be done. She saw Theon again without being seen. He shouted at men who pretended not to hear. He had no sword in his hand and his hair stuck to his forehead. There was ash on his cheek and no one told him. He looked, for a heartbeat, like the boy who had stood in the yard with Rob whirling wooden swords until they laughed too hard to breathe. Hate is a poor sculptor. It reduces everything to a single line. Arya saw the boy and the man and the lord who never would be, all at once, and she hated them each for different reasons and felt very old. She thought of going to the Godswood then, the rope, the trees, the dark where she was a very good thing at being a very bad thing. But she did not go. The castle was stirred. You do not leave a pot on a fire stirred by other hands. Not if it is your kitchen. She went to Luwin. He stood on his tower step with his hands on the stone and his head thrown back as if scenting for weather. He started when she came from the panel and then set his hand on her shoulder, absent, as one does with a child you know well. "Well, gone," she said. "The boys and Osha and Hodder, the wolves, through the trees." She lifted her chin toward the west as if the night could read direction. He exhaled and it sounded like a prayer, though he did not pray to the same gods as the trees. "You should go," he said. "You should follow." "And leave you?" The word "you" was sharp and she hadn't meant it to be, but there it was. "No. I have letters to write to no one," he said and smiled. "Anyway, a maester is not a thing you carry into a forest. We're terrible in the underbrush." "You're not a thing at all," she said, and wanted to take the words back because she heard in them the petulance of a girl who had not been given a pony. But Luwin only squeezed her shoulder once, firm game. He was not going to leave the tower. He was bound to it the way his chain bound him to all that was expected of him. She knew then that he would die here, if dying were thing the story required. Knowledge lodged in her throat like a stone. She swallowed. It did not move. "Then I'll be your raven," she said, "until the ravens come home." "Better," he said, "because you can argue when I'm wrong." "I'm never wrong." "That is the right spirit in exactly one person at a time," he said. In the dark his eyes were bright. "Tonight it is yours." Below, men shouted. Somewhere, far down the yard, a cry went up, sharp, then ugly, then cut off. The wind changed. It brought the smell of wet wool, charred wood. Fear. It brought another smell, like turned earth, rank and familiar and wrong. Arya's neck prickled. She had smelled that once on the wind in the riverlands, and men had followed it with torches and found a tree where men hung too fresh for crows. She checked the Ealing against the castle map in her head and found a path under her feet before she knew she was moving. She did not know the name then. She would learn it. In that moment she only knew that something had entered the yard that would not leave clean. Footsteps where there should not be footsteps. Laughter with no humor in it. The sound a knife makes coming free when no one wants to acknowledge it. Theon had opened Winterfell to a promise of help. Help always comes with hands you can't see all at once. Arya slid down the tower stairs and into the throat of the castle and became quieter than even a mouse. Fools were beating the drum now. Wolves would come. She would be what the gods would had made her, and what Harrenhal had burned into her, and what Syrio had taught her, and what her father had never imagined he was making when he smiled at the way she did not sit still. She felt the pack that had run in her dreams lift their heads and turn north with her. She went into the night with needle and extra bone in her hand and Winterfell moving around her like a heart inside a chest. Beating, beating, beating. The words formed in her like breath. A girl is Arya Stark of Winterfell. It did not matter that no one heard them. It only mattered that the stones did. She crossed the yard where braziers hissed in the gusts and shed their sparks like seeds that never found soil. The wind carried the smell of horses and pitch and the thin sour note of fear a man tries to swallow and cannot. In the lee of the armory she stilled and counted the breezes. They came from 3 directions, tripping over each other. The world was taut like leather pulled across a drum and beaten in no rhythm she knew. Boots took the gate steps 2 at a time. The tone of the men's voices when they called up to the wall was wrong. Hearty like men arriving from long roads with news, but too hearty. Their joy shaped with a knife. A horn sounded once and fell quiet. One of the Iron Men laughed and then cut it off with a cough, glancing to see if his captain had heard. Theon came to the fore as if he had been waiting behind the door. Arya saw him only as the cast of his shadow on the yard's packed snow, thrown by the torches. A lordling's profile, jaw lifted to be seen. "Open," he called. "Open, open, and be quick about it." He spoke like a man trying to make a word obey. The chain rattled. The portcullis rose. The men who came under it wore no sigil on their chests, only the color of wet leather and the sheen of men who sleep dressed. Their captain had a hood thrown back, and his hair lay thick as a pelt about his face. He was not big. He carried himself like a man who believes hands can make him any size. A sour man followed him, narrow and ropey as sinew pulled from a joint, a little stooped, his nose raw at the tip as if he scratched it in his sleep. That one smiled without trouble. It made Arya's skin do the opposite of what a cat's did when stroked. He smelled like cellars, mildew and old damp and the sweetness of spoiled grain. The hooded captain did something odd then. He paused beneath the portcullis and looked up. A man does not look up there unless he expects teeth. He stood in the bite of the gate with his eyes on iron. Then he stepped in quickly, before the men above had finished easing the last chain link, and slapped the nearest Iron Man on the shoulder as if he had always known his name. "Friend," he said warmly, and Arya could not hear the name he used, but she could hear the warmth, poured like honey over something sharp. "You've held well." Theon's mouth worked as if a word in it had too many edges. He made speeches poorly. Anyone could see the places where he forced the lines to come out as he had rehearsed them against walls. He announced the captain's name to the yard with a flourish that made no wind. The name slipped out like a fish. Arya caught none of it. It did not matter. Names stuck or they slithered. Her father had taught her which were which, though he had not meant to. "Come in," Theon said, and took 2 steps backward as a man does when he is inviting a guest into a house that someone else built. "You come under the protection of—" The line faltered. He gestured to the great hall as if it might prompt him. "Of the Lord of Winterfell." The captain's smile was a thin thing laid upon his face. "Do I?" he said softly. He did not say "my lord." He moved his hand as if replacing a knife he had only just decided not to draw. The men with him spread as if poured. The yard drank them. They did not look long at anything. Men who mean to stay look. These men counted. The sour one with the raw nose, Reek, Arya thought, with the quick recognition of a thing she had known for a long time without knowing she knew it, turned his head and his eyes slid over what passed for shadows. They skittered past Arya and then skated back, and she went still in a way that wasn't freezing so much as becoming the thing the cold had always been meant to shape. His gaze slid off her as if she were wet stone. He licked his upper lip and let his mouth hang half open. He smelled of tanneries and smoke-ground onion. He scratched his nose and smiled at no one. Behind them, the gate teeth hung, and 2 men on the wall looked down with their mouths ajar. One had a curl of ash caught in his beard that he had not yet noticed. They leaned on their spears in the tired way of men who had been up too long in the wrong cold. The chain's last rattle died. The yard held its breath. A voice too warm, too quick. Hands clasped. A pat that landed as if counting ribs. Theon's laugh, brittle glass. The guest's reply, a murmur with weight in it. Men drifted toward the kitchens, drawn by the idea of heat and meat even more than by meat itself. Torches thinned. The yard's light changed color. The wolves beyond the wall, Arya felt it like a thing underfoot, lifted their heads once. It slid through her, the sense of 2 lives pausing, tasting air. She slid up the stair inside the wall and pressed her eye to a murder hole. The world became a shape framed by black. The captain lifted his hands as men do when they want to show there is no weapon hidden palmed, and a small boy stepped forward with a cup. Theon moved too quickly to take it. The captain laughed and backed a half-pace, ceremonious. He drank. He smacked his lips like a man who has found something that meets a need he had not known how to name. "Wine," he said. "Gods, to drink a thing that hasn't walked out of a barrel and over your feet for once." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He lifted the cup again and toasted Theon and the walls and the moon and the men of the sea and the land and the poor stags that had lost their antlers with the winter. And each toast sounded like a man mapping a hall in his head, marking doors as he spoke. He did not finish his drink. He passed it back to the boy and kept walking. Arya tracked him with her hearing when his shape went out of the slot. He walked like a forester with his hand on a tree he meant to girdle, as if sizing how much to bite each pass. Reek padded half a step behind. Arya closed the panel. In the dark behind her forehead she saw him without sight. Rat bright, eel slick, bones and old water. She had learned to tell when a man did not care for the shape of his own face. Reek did not. He cared for everyone else's. She went to Luwin again, and found him with his hand pressed to a page as if holding it to the table stopped it flying away. "They're here," she said. "They smile." "Men who smile with their teeth shut," he said. He had a way of summing things that made her feel old and small and grateful at once. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and left a gray streak there, dust and ink ground into skin. "I had hoped for a standard, even a false one. Honesty has its comforts, even when it's a performance." "Well," he stood. His joints announced themselves. "There is nothing in my baskets that turns wolves into sheep." "You can turn a sheep into a raven," she said. "That's better." "You have too much faith in birds," he murmured, but he smiled. "Go gentle, Arya. There's a border between ears and eyes. Don't let them put you beyond it." She went to the kitchens and found Hank the spit boy, older than her by 2 years and more blackhead than boy, standing with his arms plunged in cold water up to the elbow, staring at the ripples as if they were messages. She touched the back of his hand under the water. His skin jumped. He almost jerked free and sent the bucket flying, but he checked himself with a look hard enough to chip stone. I'm not here, Arya said. His mouth opened. She shook her head. He shut it. He looked down and scrubbed something that did not need scrubbing, too hard, until his knuckles shone. She took 2 loaves from the shelf and 3 onions. She slipped 3 slices of bacon into her sleeve, hot fat pricking her wrist through the cloth, and thought of hot pie and wished he had been born to a castle that was a kitchen and not to an army that made kitchens out of other men's houses. She laid a slice of bacon on a broken brick for a cat whose ear had been long ago torn to a point, and the cat took it with a gentleman's courtesy and did not bite her fingers. She stepped along the edges of shadow, not because the light would show her, but because the pattern calmed a thing in her that would otherwise begin to shake. Below the wall walk, in the lee of a buttress where wind did odd tricks, 2 iron men had gathered with 3 of the new men. They had a look of boys from different villages meeting at a market, each trying to decide if the other's games were better. One of the strangers had a strip of pink cloth tied around his wrist, as if to remember something that might be forgotten if he did not bind it to his pulse. He laughed with no ghost in it at all and elbowed the other man so hard the second fellow dropped the hunk of meat he had been chewing, and then he laughed again at that, delighted by small losses. Arya felt a little cold blossom in a different place than the cold the wind made. Some part of her that had nothing to do with swords understood there are men who tuck away a bit of small suffering to take out later and polish. When the blow fell, it fell tidily, as if someone had written a list and crossed off the first name. The captain waited until the yard had thinned to pockets. He took Theon by the elbow and drew him near enough that the steam of their mouths met and made a single cloud. He said a word quietly. Theon turned to call for something and did not get the word out because 2 of the captain's men moved at the same time. One took the portcullis chain and slashed it loose and let it slam, teeth making their noise. The other put a hand on the throat of the man at the winch and squeezed. The sound a man makes when another man squeezes his throat is not dramatic. It is intimate and ugly and small. The man with the strip of pink around his wrist laughed again, purely for the wit of it. Iron shutting, fingers on windpipes, timing. The yard tried to decide how to sound. For a breath, nothing did. Then it was noise. Men shouted in the same words in different orders. Theon shouted the loudest. He had his hand on the hilt and did not draw for a long time, and then he drew and pointed the blade at no one. He raked it left and right as if to make the air move. When he finally found a target, it was a boy running for the stables with a pail. Theon yelled at him to stop. The boy did not. The captain smiled as if someone had just guessed how many seeds were in an apple and been right. On a wall above, a man with a crossbow took aim and pulled, and the string snapped back into his cheek with a noise like someone biting a carrot. The bolt bounced off a shield where a shield had no business being already, and the captain's man who had raised it laughed from under the rim. The shield bore no sigil. Arya felt a ridiculous anger at that. Men should declare what beasts they wear. A second bolt flew. This one struck true in someone's ribs. She did not know whose, only that the man folded around it as if embracing a child, and the child had gone entirely through him. Arya went to the places where panic makes holes. In kitchens, that place is the back step where boys run to retch. In the hall, it is the lane between the tables where men gather to fight and then trip over benches. In the kennel, it is the pen where the meanest dog lives, because men jump in last to let it out. She knew Winterfell's holes as well as she knew the seams in the hem of a dress set for growth when you are small. She eased small folk through them. She tripped a man with his own scabbard when he turned the wrong way and would have been cut through from behind. She slapped a bucket into a girl's hands and then took it away again and put a baby there instead, because you can always find water and you cannot always find children. She cut a tether with a small saw from the tack room and left it where a man with big hands could find it by feel. She left the doors to the stores half open because men presented with a door open in fear never think to look for a second door more important and unseen. The wolves' voices came from beyond the wall, a short call and an answer, the second voice younger and messier. It shivered down the brick in her bones. She wanted to answer. The body has wild places the voice never reaches. She bit her tongue. She went to the Godswood as a cloud goes, and found Luwin there not because she had known where he would be but because there was nowhere else left where a man like him belonged. The heart tree was white under the lantern light, and glasses of blood hung in the leaves. Those weren't glasses. Those were berries from a bush beyond, reflected oddly. The mind lied when it was tired. The maester stood with his hands on the carved roots and spoke to something that had no need of human tongue. When he turned at her step, his face showed no surprise, only confirmation. "Of course," he said. "You're here." "I'm your raven," she said, and forced lightness into it because gravity came without effort now. "Tell me where to fly." "Anywhere the arrows do not." His eye took in her, and then the trees, and then the sky beyond the hedge. The night had cleared in the last hour, as if the wind had convinced the clouds to be busy elsewhere. Stars lay cold and perfect in their black bowl. "Do you hear it? It's begun. The castle will burn in the places that matter to men, and not at all in the places that matter to stone. Both kinds leave marks. We will need to read them later. For now." He put a hand on the bark as a father might put his hand to the forehead of a sick child. "Do you want to go north, Arya?" She thought of wolves and springs, of Osha's sure feet and Hodder's careful strength, of Bran's face as it had emptied of anything but purpose. She wanted to go where purpose went. She wanted to follow the track their breathing had made in the air and check it each mile for danger and lick danger's face if it came near. She wanted to turn back time by the scruff and drag it into a kennel and make it stay. "I want," she said, and the words failed for a breath. "I want them to be safe." "Then go after them," Luwin said. "The gods will keep their own counsel with the tree. Men will keep counsel with men." He looked toward the hall. "There is something I must try." He smiled without teeth. "Hope, that reckless bitch. She keeps climbing onto my lap even when my bones ache with her weight." "You'll die," Arya said, came out as flat as a plan. She had meant to make it question. "If you go there." "I may," he said, "but I am already a man who stayed when others left, and there is a shape to that choice that must be completed. I think you understand shapes." She did. She hated that she did. She stepped forward and put her hand on his chain where it lay across his breast. The metal was cool and smelled of ash. "Don't let them cut this," she said. It sounded foolish, like a child's command to weather. "Don't let them take it." "No one is strong enough to take what I have already given," he said, and patted her hand, and the kindness of that nearly broke her. "Run, child." She did not run. She walked until the trees hid the lantern light, and then she walked faster until the ground became steps for her feet that arrived under them exactly as needed. The drain swallowed her by the tanner's wall. It breathed out warm and wet and smelled of hides and the old iron tang of scraped hair. She went through it into the outer dark beyond the yard and the wall, and then she ran, because there is a time in a story when running is not shame but sense. The wolfswood received her the way a sea receives a pebble, not noticing in any human manner but carrying her regardless. Tracks lay like words to someone who could read them. Hodder's were as big as frying pans, set careful and too deep. Osha's were the script of a woman who had learned to write around stones. Bran's marks were where the litter had slid and caught and slid again. The rope had cut a notch in a root, and the notch was a letter in a language Arya did not know and understood perfectly. Summer's pads had kissed mud and left 4 moons. Shaggy dogs were chaos in order. A boy's handwriting grown teeth. Arya touched each sign as if greeting friends along a road. Fox musk. Owl shit. A place where a deer had torn bark with its lower incisors and left palewood grinning. The smells made a map that your eyes could not. She breathed with her mouth half open as wolves do, making language of air. Behind, the castle muttered and then cried out and then settled into the low roaring of something that has learned it is burning and cannot do anything else about it. Men's words were small against the sound. A horn somewhere sounded again, a brief and pointless sentence. The stars moved in their imperceptible way, which is to say that they changed the world and did not appear to. She found them before dawn because Rickon could not be quiet even in his sleep. He made a noise like puppies make when their legs kick, and the noise leaked out of his mouth before he woke enough to stop it. Osha had chosen a hollow under a windfall, root-woven and snow-padded, and had covered the entrance with a mat of dead fern. Summer lay across the opening exactly as if tasked by an older god than men make. Shaggy Dog slept with his head tucked and his tail flung over his nose and his feet moving as if running in another world. Arya crouched and put her hand on Summer's shoulder, and the wolf opened one eye. And in that eye was a world larger than this one, where woods never ended and the smell of men was a thing you avoided for sport rather than survival. Then he shut it again and huffed his acceptance. Osha emerged like someone conjured from the tree itself. Her hair stood out in a mass new with sap and sweat, and her eyes were storytellers in a face choked with mud. She did not smile. She put a hand on Arya's head briefly, hard. "Girl. Woman," Arya said. "Both," Osha allowed. "Heard the castle cough. Heard men laughing who have no business with joy. Heard men crying who have plenty. We go when the light grays. The boy with the long eyes says north. I say west and then north. The big one says hotter. The little one says everything except what helps." She rubbed her mouth with the heel of her hand. "You brought trouble to M by coming, or you brought the strength to leave. It's equal." "I brought me," Arya said. "I'm what I had." "Good," Osha nodded. "Be what you have." Bran pulled himself out of the dark of the root tunnel like a boy returning from swimming under a dock. His hair was cobwebbed with fern bits and his face looked thinner than it had in the crypt. He looked at Arya the way he had looked when he said her name there, as if he had expected her and had already discussed it with a voice no one else could hear. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad," Arya said. She did not gild. He did not want gilding. But stone holds. Theon opened the gate to men who smiled and closed it on his own feet. Maester Luwin is stubborn as a stone, and you know what stones do when you push them the wrong way. "Stand," Bran said. "Stand," she agreed. "He's going to try to make sense move men. Men don't move for sense. They move for other men. That's what he can be still." Bran's mouth pressed together briefly, a boy's attempt to keep a man's tears in his skull. He nodded. "If he dies, he does it as a man doing the thing that fits his shape." Arya's throat worked. "He told me to run. I'm going to disobey him a little first." "Of course you are," Bran said, and there was warmth in it that bombed a place raw inside her. "You always did." They ate quietly. Cold onion is a meal to some men and a punishment to others. It made Arya think of Gendry and of a shed that had smelled of hay and rain and of the big boy's amused snort when she had insisted she could mend her own torn sleeve and then puckered it so badly it looked like a worm. She swallowed and chewed and made herself taste. Winter would come whether you tasted or not. It was better to meet it with your tongue awake. Osha made them move when the world had the color of bone and smoke. Hodder took both boys in turn, like a man learned to carry barrels, not by wrestling but by finding the balance point. The wolves went ahead, and in their wake mice paused and forgot their small lives for a heartbeat and then remembered to live them again. Arya ranged at the edges, where the underbrush snagged and where men would be least likely to insist she be sensible. Near midday, the air sharpened in the back of her nose. The woods grew thinner and a field opened like a mouth with white teeth. Sheep bones left from fall slaughter, clean and light and singing when the wind moved them against one another. A ruin stood beyond, a crofter's cottage taken by ivy up to the thatch. Osha gave it a cut eye. Too much sky. Inside, the hearth was a hole with old ash in it, and the bench had been gnawed by something with steady patience. Hodder ducked and hit his head on the lintel and said, "Hodder," so gently that even Shaggy Dog's ears went back. Arya left them there and went 3 tree lengths to piss. You mark yourself by the things you touch with the parts of one mentions. She kicked the snow over the place and cut back across her own track twice to make anyone who followed think her feet were confused. Then she saw smoke. A new thread, not from the rump of Winterfell but a mean sneer of a fire on the lee of the hill. Men use hills that way when they care more about wind than watch. She belly crawled up the rise until her chin rested on ice. The fire burned in a little bowl of rocks, and around it 3 men sat with their cloaks knotted up around their necks. 2 wore their hair flung in salt braids, their ears smoked by years of wind. The 3rd had bound his hair back with a strip of plain leather and had the narrow, pale look of men from the east of the north, all tendon and cold eye. They passed a thong of dried meat between them and chewed and looked at the fire more than at all else, because men will stare into something they can control if the wider dark tells them a different story. Their spears lay across their laps, points clean. No banners. The plain-haired man's boots were good and his gloves were better. "What do we do?" Arya had asked Syrio once, when the tall merman had cut at her with that thin willow of a sword of his, and she had been sure she would break if she did anything at all. He had smiled like a man and like a cat. "We stop breaking first. Then we go forward." She went sideways. She slid along the ridge on her hip until the men were out of her line of sight and she could only track them by ear. Their laughter was the wrong kind. Much of it too close to the throat, none of it rising far. She waited until one of them spat and swore and stood and stepped away to piss, until the sound of it came. She breathed twice, rolled, and came up in a squat with needle already wanting, and the man saw only the point. He was quick, and his arm came up by habit to knock aside grief. Needle slid under his wrist tendons. His hand opened and closed like a mouth surprised to be an animal instead of a part. She stepped into him, pressed the hilt into his belly with her weight, and directed the steel to where it could end the most without asking questions. He slumped as if relieved of a load, which in a way he was. The other two did not come. They had heard something they did not understand, and men in the cold choose not to understand if they can. She slid backward, belly to snow. The piss steamed. A drop fell onto the back of her hand, warm. She did not move until her fingers had finished burning with cold. She left him there with his hand still half closed and his face showing nothing at all, because there had not been time to make a decision about an expression. Back at the Crofters, she put her hand on Osha's shoulder and the woman turned, mouth already shaping a curse. Arya shook her head once like a wolf shaking snow out of its coat. "Two more," she said. "They won't be curious until they're hungry. We should be gone before their stomachs solve the riddle their ears set them." "Good girl," Osha said, and began to pack them as if they had never unpacked. Hodder lifted Bran and the boy said nothing and looked past Arya, past Osha, past the wolves, into a space his eyes could see that none of them could. Arya put a hand to his cheek. His skin was cool as stone in spring shade. He did not flinch at the touch, nor did he lean. It felt like putting your hand to a word carved in wood, there and not about you. They moved again. The woods changed from birch to fir, and the ground did not sing underfoot so much as thud. Men with the pale looks of the east leave a taste behind, old smoke, boiled roots, fat saved to use twice. It clung to the branches at a height that said they were taller than the Ironborn and shorter than Hodder. It tasted like trouble you can't justify to anyone who wasn't there. Before evening, the wind pulled a new smell through the needles. Many. The smell of leather handled too much, of wool rubbed thin at elbows, of tallow smoke caught in beards. Arya signaled with her fingers. Osha stopped as if a stick had been laid across her path. They tucked themselves into a cut bank where snow and dirt had made a lip. Summer lay across the opening again and looked like a log until he looked like death. The column passed. It was not big in the way armies are big, with a line so long it changes the world's ideas about distance. It was big in the way a bad decision is big. You could see where it began and had to imagine the weight behind it. Men walked in pairs, then fours, then bunched when the path forced them to. They had a standard, but it hung furled. The flayed man was there regardless, in little scraps. A pin on a glove, the stitch in a man's cap. Arya saw a face that did not blink enough. Pale eyes like winter water over a shore of rot-color hair. He rode, though the horse looked offended to carry him. He wore no fur. He did not seem to register cold in the same way other men do. A dog ran at his stirrup with a tongue like ham. The sour one, Reek, walked under the horse's shadow and smiled constantly, as if someone told him a joke at noon and he had been polite enough to keep the smile on for supper. The men spoke in low voices. Sometimes one laughed. It was never a joke any of them would tell on any day when they were not all together. They smelled tired and satisfied. Winterfell's smoke had gotten into their hair. One man had a crusted smear on his boot that was not mud. Another touched the knife at his belt as often as a nervous boy touches the place where a fiddle would be if he owned one. The pale-eyed rider did not look left or right. Once he bent and said a thing softly to Reek. Reek nodded so quickly he almost made a bow of it on the move and looked around for a way to love the order. They passed like weather, a pressure change and a headache and then a front gone east. When the last man's boot print went by and the last set of shoulders hunched into the wind and the sound softened to the tread of the living world again, Osha let out a breath she had been believing her body had forgotten how to make. Hotter said hotter so low it might have been the name of the god under the snow. Rickon stirred and banged his heel against Shaggy Dog's side and Shaggy Dog thumped his tail once. Heavily, very quiet for a tail. Who? Osha asked, despite herself. Trouble, Arya said. The kind that smiles when the fire licks its hands. He has a man with him who can be any smell. Not wrong. Osha's mouth skewed. And Winterfell? Smoke. Arya swallowed a feeling that had no easy name. It'll take a count of days for the stones to stop speaking about it. We can't go back, Bran said. His voice had a bottom in it at last, not much, but enough to hold a word without spilling. Not for a long time. Not until we come as something that can put stones back in the shape they remember, Arya said, and the phrase felt as if it had come through her mouth from a place behind her somewhere. They slept in turns in that shallow cut because the earth there had remembered how to be warm once and trying to remember warmed it enough. In her sleep, Arya dreamed of the heart tree. When she put her ear to its trunk, she heard not sap but hoofbeat. She woke to the sound the world makes when a bird shocks the air with its wings. Dawn had limned the snow in the colors of old iron. Osha was already up, checking the sky with a fairness that did not expect anything and would take what it was offered without complaint. We go, she said. They went. The shape of the days took on a rhythm. Move until the light is in the wolf's favor. Eat the thing that is easiest to eat. Drink where the ice is thinnest. Check for men and signs of men. Ignore the signs of gods. Adjust. Arya built fires where you could not tell a fire had been. The little starved ones that warm fingers and don't give you away. She kept the balance between Bran's quiet and Rickon's loud by slicing it the way she would a loaf to make it feed more mouths. She cleaned needle with snow and with the border of a rag that had once been a soft sleeve and not think about what sleeve. On the fourth day they crossed a stream that had been a river before the cold. A crow hopped from stone to stone ahead of them, playing the fool to draw wolves or men. It was an old trick and Arya did not fall for it, but Rickon did, laughing once, and the laughter made Summer turn his head with a look that was nearly reproach. On the fifth, they found boot prints that wandered in circles until the circles made a spiral, and then that spiral petered out where the snow had drifted. Osha crouched, considered, and tipped her hand as if to say, back into the world. On the sixth, they found a girl sleeping in the hollow of a fallen beech. Her hair matted with burrs, her lips cracked. She had tucked a wooden spoon up her sleeve as if it were a knife. When she woke, she tried to stab Arya with it. Arya let her. It did not hurt. She gave the girl half an onion and a piece of hard cheese and watched her eat as if the girl could become another creature between bites. The girl's eyes went from flat to fevered and back. She wore a string with a bone on it around her neck. Arya asked her name and she said 3 different ones and then laughed. Names were a tangle that had been cut for her by something with no patience for knots. They left her with the rest of the onion and a direction, and the wolves put their noses in her hair and told her what the world smelled like without words. Arya wanted to take her. She did not. There are people you unmake when you make them yours. They went north and west until the sky darkened at noon and the breath that came out of your mouth made shapes that stayed longer than the words you said. Somewhere behind and east, men hammered something out of someone. Arya could feel the pulse of it in her teeth sometimes at night when she set her back to a pine trunk and waited for dreams to choose among themselves. Memories came that weren't hers. Sometimes in sleep she ran with the pack, and sometimes she sat on a parapet with her legs dangling over the yard and swung them and laughed because Robb had said something sly and Sansa had answered with lemon-sweet contempt and Father had not heard any of it, or had heard and decided he had not. The smell of lemon came on the air once for real, and she looked up as if Sansa might be climbing a tree with her hair undone. In the crook of a wind-stunted maple, Arya took the Bravosi coin from her boot and held it to her tongue. It tasted like iron and the inside of old purses and a promise she did not fully understand. Vala Morgulis is a door no one should tell a child about. She turned the coin in her fingers and made its edges bite into the pads. She imagined saying the words at a dock with gulls and fish guts and men who would call her boy, and she imagined saying them in a hall where men wore soft sandals and listened with their heads cocked just so. And she imagined saying them at a tree with a face. The tree would not care. The tree's mouth already said better words. She put the coin back and it sat against her heel like a small cold truth waiting its hour. Once, a rider came down a game trail from the north faster than sense and reckless with the kind of luck that runs out for men who depend on it. He wore a cloak dyed with something that had been red once and was now the color of old meat. His beard had icicles in it. His horse's flank steamed like soup. He slid to a stop when Shaggy Dog put his body where the horse's knee meant to go and made the horse choose to live. The man's eyes rolled to show white and then settled. He saw the wolves first, and then the children, and then the woman, and then the big man. The order of that told Arya what she needed to know. He spat, not near but not far either. "News," he said, as if warning them not to kill him before he got to the good part. "If you move east, you find a woman with a red dress who thinks fire can tell her things. If you move west, you find a village that used to have a sept and now has a speared roof. If you move south, you'll find roads that can't make up their minds. If you move north, you'll find nothing but the truth. The truth is snow." "We know that," Osha said shortly. "Men like to bring you truths you have paid for already and call it commerce." He looked at Bran long enough that Arya wanted to put her hand on her brother's face again and make a wall of palm and fingers. "You're small folk?" he asked into the air. "We're what we need to be," Arya said, and he laughed with an open mouth and no kindness and kicked his horse. He left the way he came, the horse's shoes punching syllables in the frozen mud. Summer chuffed like a man who has decided not to bother speaking aloud. Shaggy Dog sneezed. On the 8th day, a storm came in like a troop of drunks with musical instruments, disorder under a single command. The sky went the color of iron filings, silver and grit, and the first flakes were fat enough to thump when they landed on your hood. Osha led them to a copse of alders lean as a harp and strung her shawl between branches and crouched under it as if she meant to be a rabbit. Hodder hunched and made himself half the size a man like him can be, which is still twice the size of most men. Bran shivered and said nothing at all, and after a time Summer simply lay over him, spreading warmth with the severe patience of a mountain. Arya talked to Rickon about nothing, why moss grows on one side of trees and not the other, why you can count cold more ways than counting heat, what frogs do in the winter, and Rickon talked back about everything. Why moss should pick a side and stick with it, why cold was stupid and needed its ears boxed, what he would do to any frog he found sleeping. Osha smiled into the collar of her coat so that only the stitches knew. The storm made a tent of sound around them. The tent bent and flapped and did not blow away. When it passed, the world was new again and all the old things in it newly buried. Tracks laid yesterday were gone. The only marks were those of the storm. They lay across fields and woods indiscriminately, erasing a wrong and a right alike. They ate a man's path and a wolf's with the same mouth. Arya's anger at that should have found an object. Weather, gods, but it didn't. It stayed a white weight in her belly and made her careful. That evening their fire died for lack of anything to feed it that wouldn't betray them in smoke, and they went to sleep under a roof too cold to hold heat. Arya lay awake and listened for the sounds that do not belong to woods. Far off, a fox screamed, and a man would have thought a woman was dying if he did not know foxes. Closer, a branch cracked, and the crack did not echo because the snow swallowed it. She began to drift between waking and the other thing, that watery land. She dreamed she was in the great hall and every seat was filled with men who had no faces. And when father walked past her, he had a face and it was kind, and he put his hand on her head and told her she was a good girl for not saying anything at all. When she woke, there was ice on her lashes. Everyone she loved had left her asleep and gone. No, they were there. Summer lifted his head and looked sideways at her, as if to say he had never not known she had awakened. Think of Winterfell, she told herself, and the thought felt like a girl pulling her own hair into braids. The stones, the passages, the drain, the heart tree, Luwin's hands on the old roots, the way the pipes throbbed with heat under the laundry, the way steam made your hair curl and your skin feel like it had been told a secret. The sound a door made when you set the pin back into its hinge just so. Everything that can be remembered matters because the day will come when someone will need it and you will not be there to tell it to them, and only the stone will remember, or the tree, or the water. At dawn a raven found them. It came out of a sky that looked like something you could break with a good stone. Its wings making that leathery slap, and its head held too high for a humble bird. It circled twice, cawed once, and landed on a dead limb above them with insolence. It watched Summer. Summer watched it. After a time it opened its beak and barked a nonsense that somehow made Arya think of tables and ink. It flew off east. Osha spat after it. "Birds that fly where men tell him," she said. "I don't like that kind." The world tightened around them for a while then, as if the storm had drawn a line and dared them to cross it. The trail went over a hill and then over another hill that had a different name, and the names were in languages no one spoke now, bones of words left in the earth. In a swale they found a buried cart's handle sticking up like a black finger. Osha lifted it, and it came away with a sigh, and under the snow was a sack of oats and a wooden bowl and a draw knife with a nick in its blade. They took the oats. The knife was too heavy for what it gave. Rickon wanted the bowl. Osha let him have it. He wore it on his head for half the day until Shaggy Dog got tired of being mocked by a boy in a hat and took it away and cracked it and then chewed a chunk out of it until it was no longer useful to either boy or dog. Rickon howled. Osha laughed. Bran looked at Arya with a kind of apology in his eyes, and Arya shrugged. Losses were the things that taught your shoulders to live. On the 10th day, with the cold gathered in their sleeves and everyone quiet from the effort of being alive, they reached a ridge that looked down over the white back of the world, and beyond it a smear of darker trees that could be the start of the Wolfswood proper, the bit of it men mean when they say that name. Osha squinted. "Later," she said. "What?" Rickon was raw-edged with boredom. He had begun to chew the inside of his cheek, and his smile had a white line where the skin had toughened. "Later what? Later where? Later when? Later we'll die if we don't keep our wits," Osha said sweetly. "Now hush and be a brave lord. Brave lords don't make their voices bigger than their bodies." "I'm a wolf," Rickon muttered, but he tucked his hands and kicked less snow with his heels. Arya turned her head. The wind brought something new, small and precise, like the sound a needle makes in a quiet room. Metal on stone, but not from a forge. A man's breath constrained behind his teeth. A woman's sob clipped short, like a string jerked. The world shivered around those sounds, as if a song had been struck wrong and every string on the instrument had felt it. "Down," she said. They dropped into the snow and became plants. 2 riders appeared on a cut track. The men had faces that had never learned to be young. One had a scarf tied around his nose and mouth so that only his eyes showed, and they were red-rimmed and leaking. The other had a mark across his cheek like fingers that had been there long enough to fade. They rode with the slow care of men looking and not wanting to see what they feared. Behind them 2 boys walked with ropes in their hands. The ropes went to a woman who had no hood and hair that had learned to knot itself without hands. She carried a bundle wrapped in a cloak piece, and the bundle made no sound. The boys laughed sometimes, a small horrid giggle like hiccups. The men laughed when the boys did. One spoke. Arya did not hear the words, only their shape. He made a joke about being hungry. Men make that joke when they want to keep something bigger from eating them. Osha's hand found Arya's wrist. It was not a restraining grip. It was awareness, a hand to a pulse. Hodder's breath made musical instruments of the holes in the scarf tied around his face. Bran's eyes were open very wide and saw everything. "What can we do?" Arya said in her head to Syrio, to Father, to Luwin, to thief gods and tree gods, and the thing in her that had begun to move into wolves and out of them. The answer was the same one as always: not everything. The next right thing shaped the size of your hand. She slid out of the hollow and became a shadow that had decided to be snow for a while. The riders did not see her because men on horses forget to look down. The boys did not see her because boys never see what they have decided is not there. The woman did not see her because her world had shrunk to the size of the thing in her arms and the air that needed to go into her lungs. Arya came level with the second boy and put Needle's point against his belly and walked with him while the riders walked, so that when he looked down he saw the thing, and when he opened his mouth to scream she made a tiny noise, and he shut it again because men are not the only creatures who can be taught to obey small sounds. She cut the rope where it looped the woman's waist. The woman stumbled. Arya caught her elbow as if they were girls running, not captor and captured. The boy made his noise then, high and wild. The rider turned, pulling his horse round with a jerk that made the animal flatten its ears. Osha moved out of the air and put a stone in the side of his head with the sling she had carried this whole long road, and the sound it made was like a cup cracking in a cupboard. He swayed and fell. Hodder came out of snow like a hill deciding to move and picked up the second boy by the back of his tunic and lifted him with disgust. Shaggy Dog had been moving before anyone else, because that is what Shaggy Dog was, and reached the first boy and put his mouth lightly on the boy's forearm as a mother takes a pup, and the boy fainted. The second rider drew and then did not, because the wolf rose like a gray wave and showed him a throat not worth cutting. He froze. The woman clutched the bundle to her chest and stared at Arya with huge eyes that had decided awe was safer than sense. Arya looked into them and saw a person deciding whether to be afraid of the wrong thing. "Go," Arya said. "Run that way. Don't make a straight line. Don't stop. Don't thank me. Go." The woman went. She had known how to run before. Her legs remembered. Osha had a length of rope in her hands and had bound the second rider in 3 motions that had no commas between them. The first rider lay with his face to the sky and his eyes quietly closing and opening as if considering which position they preferred. Rickon stood over him with his little fists balled. He wasn't smiling. Arya touched his shoulder. "We go," she said, and he nodded. The solemn nod of a boy learning where his body should be when the world tears. They left the men in the snow as if they had been arranged by someone with a lesson in mind. The wolves paced beside them for a time, then ran ahead to check the way, then circled back and planted their noses in Hodder's boot prints, because scent can be comfort as much as instruction. At night Arya dreamed of the yard again, only this time there were faces. Ser Roderick's face, very quiet. Theon's face, the mouth set as if to say something and never saying it. The other face, the pale-eyed one, did not change no matter where she stood, as if it had been painted by someone who did not believe in perspective. She woke and the fire was out and the stars were a frost you could walk on if you were the right sort of creature. She put her hand out and laid it on Bran's hand, and his fingers moved a little in sleep and held hers briefly and then let go, because you cannot hold what must go. "Tomorrow we cut west," Osha said in the morning, with the decision of a person who has worried a thought like a tooth and found no pain. "Then we turn up under the pines and you'll smell the salt from White Knife even if you can't see it. Then we turn back from the salt because it will bring men and not fish, and I don't want either of those. Then we go where the deer still sleep in the lee of gorse because that means no men with dogs. Then we find a hall that will take in a woman and a big man and 2 boys and 2 wolves and not ask the wrong questions. Then I leave you, little lord." She looked at Bran when she said it, and her mouth softened in a way Arya had learned meant the woman was making a choice that would hurt her and thought it worth it anyway. "I'll take the little wolf the other way. Same meat, different stew." Arya's throat tightened. She understood this part of the shape. "I'll go where I can be used most," she said. She did not look at Bran, and she did not look at Rickon, and she looked at the place between Osha's collarbones because it was easier to look at a place on a person than a person when something inside you wanted to pick up 2 children and run both directions. "North," Bran said simply. "If you can." "If I can," Arya agreed. "If meant a coin in a boot and a name you could speak and a ship that would take a boy who wasn't. If meant a man with a hood and a smell like cellars and what might have to be done about him. If meant wolves who had let her be part of their breath once and might again. If meant everything." She thought of Luwin in the Godswood and her chest filled with cold water. She had disobeyed him a little. She had gone after the wolves long enough to be sure their feet still knew where to fall and their mouths still closed and opened on air. Now she felt the pull east back toward stone. People sometimes talk about obligations as if they live in the head and can be arranged like cups on a shelf. Arya knew better. They live in the gut, in the hands, in the soles of the feet, and you do not arrange them so much as you stand with them until they make you walk in a direction. "I have to see," she said, not to anyone. Osha looked at her as if measuring a hide for a coat. If it can be done, girl. It can, Arya said, and did not let herself doubt because doubt wasted heat. I'll come back. She snorted at the shape of that. The world did not owe you the courtesy of letting you make oaths. If I can. Go then, Bran said. He looked at her with those eyes that had filled with more than a boy's share. Be careful. Be Arya. I can't be anything else, she said. And for the first time since she had come under the walls, she felt the truth of that as a comfort and not a cage. She left at noon because men rest at noon in winter, and the shadows they cast then are short and honest, and you can step from one to the next if your feet know how. The woods received her, and the woods gave her back what they always give you if you go alone. The sounds you make, the breath you take, the thought that follows you and won't be left because it is you. She cut east. The snow held her weight differently where the ground was hollowed by old roots. She moved with the economy of someone who has no interest in confronting anything she did not need to. By nightfall, the smoke was in her hair again. It lay in the hollows of the land. The sky over Winterfell had the faint stain of light that means men are there and busy. She lay under a hedge and ate a piece of cheese so hard she had to shave it with needle and listen to the night. She heard men with mail on, which is a sound you learn inside your teeth. She heard men with boiled leather, which is a whisper and a soft bump. She heard one raven and then three. She heard a song. A woman sang in a voice that made the hair on her arms lift. She sang as if alone, not for anyone else, because there is a way a person's voice sounds when they are singing to keep from breaking and not to be heard. Arya put her head in her arms and let the sound go over her like water. She slept a little and woke with a stone pressed to her cheek that her face had decided to learn. She went to the drain the way water remembers to go downhill. The grate was in place. Her hands went where they needed. Metal bit skin. It did not matter. She lowered herself into the world's throat and felt the breath of the castle on her again. Hotter and dirtier. Her body remembered the spaces. Men make detours out of fear and forget them when fear fades. Castles keep theirs forever. In the laundry passage, she heard the scrape of a chair pulled too close to a table and the clink of a cup set down too hard. A man sighed and made the sigh mean more. She ghosted past. In the scullery, someone cried very quietly and someone else told them to shut it without malice. In the passage behind the great hall, she stopped, because the sound there made her think of beech nuts underfoot, hollow and husked. The hall itself held talk. The pale-eyed captain's voice carried without lifting, the way a blade cuts without you seeing the motion. Theon's voice had a burr in it, and he had not learned to file it down. He apologized 3 times in the space of one speech. The captain accepted each apology as if it were a gift he had always wanted and had never had the courage to ask for. "My men," he said. "My men grew excited when they realized their work had been easier than they feared. You understand, men. It is admirably human. And Theon stumbled. My Winterfell." The man made a thoughtful little humming sound and Arya wanted to punch teeth. "Stones hold heat poorly," he said. "We will build anew." He said "we" the way men say it when they mean I. "You must be tired. I have arranged a room for you that smells less of wet dog. No offense to the north." Theon made a noise like a boy catching a ball wrong in cold weather. "No offense," he said. He did not sound offended. He sounded relieved to be told when to sleep. Arya wanted to hate him and could not do it properly. The distance between wanting and doing turned inside her like a small wheel. She slipped away. The gods would came without her looking for it, because the core of Winterfell lay under everything else, and once you step into the right path your feet do the remembering. The heart tree's face looked older. Someone had lit a lamp near it and then forgotten it, and the oil had burned low and choked. Smoke fingered the carved eyes. Arya's throat closed. A shape lay beside the roots. "Maester?" she asked, though she already knew the shape of the answer. The word went out and came back, and the shape did not change. She dropped to her knees and slid. Her hands touched cloth that had taken on too much of the world's wet and weight. Luwin was there and also not there, in the way of men who are leaving and do it in their own time because there is still something to put in order that requires the presence of the person who knows where the papers are. His breath was a stitch, then a gap, then a stitch. A dark wet spread from his side, and his hands, when she took one, were very cold around the knuckles and very warm in the palm. "Arya," he said, and he had to swallow between syllables, and the swallow sounded like work. "I knew you'd disobey me. You told me to run," she said, and her voice shook as if there were too many bones in it. "I went as far as the wolves, and then my feet stopped." "Good feet," he said. "Stubborn, like the rest of you." He turned his head as if to see the tree's face, and the movement cost him something she could not give back. "I told some boys once. The story of the Stark kings carved here, one for each. I left one out. I made it up, you see. There aren't enough kings for all the statues. I didn't want them to count and be disappointed." He choked a little laugh. "Men will make a false thing if it saves a child a moment's sadness. The gods must forgive us that." She pressed his hand to her cheek. "Don't go," she said. "Not yet." "I must," he whispered. "But others will come and others will go in you." His eyes found hers, and for a breath were younger than she had ever seen them. "You must do the thing that is always done by those who are both wolf and girl. You must remember and you must move. We need both. The world forgets in one direction and clings in the other. You are the joining. Forgive me for putting such philosophy on you when you should be eating supper." She did not know whether to laugh or to sob, so she did the thing that was possible. She held his hand and kept it warm until it did not matter what temperature it was, because the man who needed warmth had gone and left the hand behind. When he left, he did it gently. Some men depart like doors blown open, some like ladders pulled up in haste. He left like a book closed softly by the person who had been reading it. Arya set his hand on his breast and folded his other hand over it and smoothed the fabric of his sleeve and kissed his brow. It tasted like old paper and ash and peppermint someone had once tucked in his chest to sweeten breath and left there. She sat with him, and the tree listened, and a bird outside made the little click-click that means it has found something to eat and is not lonely while it chews. She left him when she could. Grief had a size here. She could carry it. In the hall, men laughed, and the laugh was a wall. The pale-eyed captain's voice lifted not in shout, but in a tone that told the hall to change shape to accommodate him. Theon did not speak. She found the panel in the dark with her fingers without looking. Her body knew which grains ran where. She slipped through and into the cold passage, and then into the scullery, and the scullery into the drain. The grate came up obediently, and she went out into the weather. Outside the walls, the snow had a crust like sugar burnished with heat, and her boots broke it delicately. She did not turn west or north immediately. She went to a place where the ground showed the ghost of 2 sets of boot prints from the day before and laid her own feet into them, heel to toe, as if stepping into old selves. She came to the copse where she and Osha had crouched that first night, and where she had smelled beer and breath and found the rhythm of the watch. The rhythm was different now. Men change drums when new hands take the sticks. She counted the beats. She learned the new song. She did not sleep that night. She sat cross-legged under a hedge and counted how many times she swallowed when she did not have to, and then stopped doing it. Beyond the hedge, the pale-eyed captain's men took 2 boys into the yard with sacks over their heads and made everyone look. The sacks moved as the boys breathed. The men did a thing meant to be a lesson, and anyone with a head could see it was only fear showing its lack of imagination. Arya did not draw, though the string of her heart was tight enough to twang. She held still and engraved the moment behind her eyes, because you must know where to put your hate or it will wander and ruin you while you do important work. When dawn washed the bones of the trees silver, she touched the ground where Bran's litter had scratched a path and felt how the scratch had filled a little with new snow. North, Osha had said. West, she had said first. The wolves had gone that way, their scent pulled like a hand. Arya lifted her face and tasted it. She could follow and probably catch and then be useful and then be herself again among people who named her without having to think. She turned east again instead and did the thing that hurt. She cut her own track back the way it had just been made so that someone could not read 2 choices as easily. Then she turned north. The trees closed around her, and her breath made a ghost that went before and scattered on the twigs. She caught them 2 days later, the wolves, the boys, the woman, the big man, because she had learned a kind of mercy from Luwin that had nothing to do with knives and everything to do with persistence. She did not say what had happened in the hall. She did not say what had happened under the tree. She said, "We keep going." "Winterfell?" Rickon asked, and his lower lip pushed out in a way that would have made Mother raise an eyebrow. "Always," she said. "But not by walking toward it now." Bran's hand found hers again, as if he wanted to see how warm she was. Summer pressed his shoulder into Bran's side and looked at Arya without blinking for a long time. In that look she felt a thing settle, a knowledge that did not fit into words because words have edges and this was edgeless. A pack had accepted a shape that included her in the space she occupied right then. It did not promise future inclusion. Wolves do not think in promises. It was enough. They moved. They would move again and again because that is what living is until it is not. Behind them, Winterfell burned in the places that mattered to men and not at all in the places that mattered to stone. And in the Godswood a man's body cooled while his words still warmed the people who had heard them. Ahead, snow and pine and the particular sound ice makes when it takes a branch and lets it go. Osha pointed. Hodder hummed under his breath a song with one word. Rickon threw a snowball and missed and laughed anyway. Bran looked forward and did not blink until he had to. Arya counted her steps. When she reached 100 she began again, because she was still a girl and a wolf and a water dancer and a raven and the thing in her that wanted the world to hold the shapes she loved. It would not. She would learn new shapes, and hold them anyway. She slid needle under her belt so the hilt pressed the place between her ribs where her breath began, and she followed the tracks into the trees until the trees were all there was, and then the trees began to contain a path again, because that is the terrible mercy of the world. It makes ways even while you think you cannot move in any direction at all.